Good morning. We are going to talk about the leaders of the Civil War. You see my wordle that I made here on the screen. Different words that come to mind when I think about the Civil War. So take a look at that real quick and make sure that you know these words, because these are words that we either have talked about or we will talk about. And so I hope that you enjoy this. Some of the pictures on here are from my time at the Confederacy Museum, which I really enjoyed, and I encourage all of you to visit. So the leaders of the Civil War. I saw this map of the Museum of the Confederacy, and it really explained the distribution of wealthy and people and slaves during Civil War times. I thought it was interesting because you can see that the richest states are not in the north like we would expect them to be. They are actually Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. The poorest states are those in the darkest blue, which are in the north, and the richer states are the ones that would have large plantations, or they were port cities, especially these cotton plantations. And you can see the shadowing on it. The shadowing represents the slave population in the area. You can see the darkest areas are those with the highest slave population, and those areas are Virginia, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and a little part there in Texas. I found this map interesting as I thought about the Civil War and the toll that it took on the people that lived in these wealthy areas. And I thought that was really interesting and wanted to share that with you. Now let's change the pace a bit and let's look at Abraham Lincoln. Here you can see a picture of Abraham Lincoln after the Battle of Antietam. He was 6'4" without his hat, and sometimes wearing this hat he was over 7 feet tall. Now, while Abraham Lincoln was president, he gave the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation. As part of the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln said, "All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state shall be thenceforth and forever free." And remember that this was his attempt to free the slaves even in the Confederacy. And as we've discussed, it wasn't effective right then, but it sent a message that when the North won, slavery would not be allowed. During the Gettysburg Address, he said, "The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." And this explains that the main purpose of the war was, in fact, to save the Union. Now, Abraham Lincoln was married to Mary Todd, and this is her, and he had a family. And these are his 3 sons. He was particularly close to his youngest son, Tad, which is standing there next to him. Now, let's look at Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was 5'11", for those of you who are wondering, and he was the president of the Confederacy. We don't have as much information about him, but we do know that he was involved in politics long before he became the president of the Confederate States of America. He looks kind of like Abraham Lincoln when you look at pictures. And remember that he was married to Verena Howell, which is this lovely lady here. And together they had 4 children. And these are his 4 children. Now, I want us to switch gears, and we're going to talk about 2 other leaders. The first one we're going to talk about is Robert E. Lee. Real quick before we do that, this is a Confederate flag I took a picture of that actually flew in the Civil War. Then when the Civil War was over, they collected a lot of these flags, and this one, as you can see, has a big hole in it where it was ripped. It has some stains on it at the top there, and they did testing on it. It really was human blood that was found on this flag. And so this is in the Museum of the Confederacy, one of the many flags there. Now, the 2 other leaders that we need to talk about are Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. And these 2 men were the leaders of the military for each side of the war. So let's start here with this man, Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee grew up in Virginia and called it his home. He was offered the command of the Union troops, but he turned it down because he couldn't bear to fight against Virginia. So he returned south, and he became the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. This was the main fighting body of the Confederate troops. And truth be told, Lee was opposed to the states seceding. He was opposed to many of the things that the South stood for. But the end of the war was marked by this great man surrendering to Grant in Appomattox. He had a big hand in rebuilding the South, and he spoke out for Southerners to accept the defeat and to begin healing. The other man is our Northern military leader, and that is Ulysses S. Grant. He was the commander of the Union Army, and he was the last one to hold this title because the Union Army just became the United States Army, a branch of our current military. After this, Grant was he was a strong leader throughout the whole Civil War, and he was not afraid to fight. He was described as an aggressive commander and given credit for the Union winning the war. After depleting the Southern Army and capturing key Southern cities and ports, he accepted Lee's surrender in Appomattox. Grant actually went on to become our 18th president, and he served 2 terms in office. This is a picture of a painting of Lee and Grant in Appomattox. And this is actually from the Museum of the Confederacy. This is the uniform that Lee actually wore and the sword that he actually wore during the surrender at Appomattox. The next man we need to talk about is Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He was a commander of Confederate troops as part of the Army of Northern Virginia, and he was considered one of Lee's right-hand men. He got his nickname because as troops were retreating at the First Battle of Bull Run, he stood there like a stone wall and regathered troops for another charge. He was wounded after the Battle of Chancellorsville on accident by one of his own men and developed pneumonia and died. The next man, and last but not least, was Frederick Douglass. Now, we know that he was a leader in the abolitionist movement, but we need to mention him again as a Civil War leader because he was an advisor to President Lincoln during the Civil War. He convinced Lincoln that the African American population would be a good addition to the Union Army. And because of his argument, recruitment was open and an all-black unit was formed. Douglass had a direct hand in the recruitment process and recruited Northern blacks to serve in the Union Army. This included his 2 sons who served. This unit of African Americans fought many harsh battles, and though they were not treated equally with the white troops, they were still proud to be part of the Civil War and fight to keep the Union together and abolish slavery. This picture here is of a book that lists the men that were part of a unit. And then the next 2 pictures here are Confederate dollars. And if you'll remind me, I have some of these that you can actually look at in the classroom and hold. And then finally, we have these uniforms from Confederate soldiers, and there's different soldiers with their pictures and different uniforms that they wore depending on their job. Something I want you to keep in mind is that all of these leaders, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Frederick Douglass, and even the presidents, Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln, played key roles in the Civil War. There were many, many other men and women who were important to the progress and the outcome of the Civil War. But you have to remember that this war was particularly bad because it split families. Brothers were literally fighting brothers, and the 620,000 casualties in this war were all Americans, and it marked the greatest loss of American life in any war. The men who were leading in this war were in a difficult position during a tough time in our nation. And like Lee, they didn't always agree with everything that was happening, but they did their best to serve where they were needed. I hope that you enjoyed looking at some of these pictures and learning about these leaders. And I really do hope that you do your homework and bring it to class tomorrow. And remember all this information as we prepare to take a quiz on Friday. Have a great evening, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.